The research began as an ordinary academic project focused on labor systems in pre-revolutionary Russia, particularly within the vast logging operations of Siberia. The original goal was simple and practical: to understand how work crews were organized, how production quotas were met, and how industrial extraction supported imperial expansion. It was meant to be conventional historical research, the kind that relies on government reports, company records, payroll documents, and transportation statistics. The intention was to gather data, arrange it into clear tables, compare trends, and reach predictable conclusions. There was no expectation of uncovering anything unusual. This was supposed to be a routine study that would eventually become another minor contribution to economic history. During the early stages, most of the material seemed to confirm existing interpretations. Records described seasonal labor migration, harsh working conditions, and high worker turnover. Logging camps were portrayed as temporary settlements built quickly and abandoned just as fast. Workers were described as poor peasants, prisoners, or contracted laborers who endured extreme cold in exchange for minimal wages. Everything fit neatly into familiar historical narratives. But while examining photographic archives to supplement the written data, something unexpected began to appear. The first unusual image was found in a collection of glass plate negatives from the late 19th century. It showed a group of loggers standing beside freshly cut trees, posing briefly for the camera before returning to work. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. But one figure stood out. He appeared far taller than the others, almost unnaturally so. His head rose well above his colleagues, and his shoulders were level with their faces. At first, the assumption was that this was a trick of perspective. Perhaps he was standing closer to the camera. Perhaps the ground was uneven. Such explanations are common in old photographs. However, further inspection raised doubts. The shadows in the image fell consistently across all figures. The snow patterns beneath their boots were level. The surrounding trees provided fixed reference points. The camera angle was straightforward and symmetrical. There was no visible distortion. The man was not closer to the lens. He was standing on the same ground as everyone else. He was simply much larger. Curiosity led to a search for similar images. Instead of finding one or two anomalies, dozens began to surface. Russian imperial archives contained entire folders of logging crew photographs showing the same pattern. French scientific expeditions had documented labor forces in Siberia and preserved their images in national collections. Swedish logging companies, known for their meticulous record-keeping, had maintained photographic records of their workers. In all these sources, the same phenomenon appeared repeatedly. Among ordinary-sized men stood individuals of extraordinary height and build. What made these images especially striking was their ordinary nature. The large individuals were never highlighted. They were not placed in front. They were not labeled. They were not identified as curiosities. They wore the same winter coats, fur hats, and heavy boots as everyone else. They held the same axes and saws. They stood in the same lines during group photographs. They were photographed while working, resting, and posing with their teams. Nothing about the framing suggested that they were considered unusual. Written records reinforced this impression. Expedition journals and company reports occasionally mentioned strong workers or exceptionally developed laborers, but never with surprise or fascination. A French survey from the 1890s casually noted several workers estimated at nearly 3 meters tall, then immediately moved on to discussing timber transport routes. There was no speculation, no medical interest, no attempt to explain. The tone was clinical and dismissive, as if such individuals were simply part of the local workforce. As the research continued, a clear timeline emerged. From approximately the 1870s until the early 1910s, documentation consistently showed these unusually large workers in Siberian logging operations. They appeared in multiple regions, under different employers, and in various national archives. They were not limited to a single ethnic group or company. They were part of a broader industrial system. Then, abruptly, the evidence stopped. After the early 1910s, the photographs changed. Group images now showed only average-sized men. Expedition reports no longer mentioned extraordinary workers. Company records became silent on physical variations within crews. The transition was not gradual. It happened within a few years. One decade contained abundant evidence. The next contained almost none. There was no official explanation for this disappearance. No reports of disease. No records of mass relocation. No discussions of policy changes. The workers did not appear elsewhere in the empire or abroad. They simply vanished from documentation. This sudden absence was more unsettling than their presence had been. It suggested not a natural decline, but a deliberate shift in what was recorded and preserved. What began as routine research had now become something else entirely. The data no longer fit comfortably into existing models. The photographs, the journals, and the company files pointed toward a forgotten aspect of industrial history that no one seemed willing to confront. The first section of evidence alone was enough to raise serious questions about what had been overlooked, ignored, or quietly removed from the historical record. As the investigation moved beyond photographs and written records, attention turned toward physical objects left behind in the Siberian forests. If unusually large workers had truly been part of these operations, traces of their presence should remain in the tools, equipment, and structures they used. Historical industries leave material evidence, especially in remote regions where abandonment is more common than redevelopment. Siberia, with its vast distances and harsh climate, preserves industrial remains remarkably well. What emerged from this examination was a second layer of evidence that reinforced the photographic record. Logging tools recovered from old camps, museums, and private collections displayed proportions that did not match standard human ergonomics. Two-man crosscut saws from Siberian sites frequently measured between 12 and 16 feet in length. Comparable tools used in North America and Scandinavia during the same period were significantly shorter. More revealing than the blade length was the distance between the handles. In many cases, the grips were spaced 40 to 50 inches apart. For an average-sized worker, this spacing would force both arms into near full extension, reducing control and mechanical advantage. Such a design would make sustained labor inefficient and exhausting. Yet these tools showed clear signs of heavy use. The handles were worn smooth by repeated gripping. The blades displayed sharpening marks and stress patterns consistent with regular work. They were not experimental prototypes or ceremonial objects. They were practical instruments that had been used extensively. For someone with longer arms and greater reach, the wide grip spacing would have been comfortable and effective. What appeared impractical for normal workers would have been ideal for much larger ones. Other implements supported the same conclusion. Axes with handles exceeding 7 feet in length, splitting mauls weighing more than 80 pounds, and elongated pike poles were occasionally recovered from former logging regions. These objects were far heavier and larger than standard tools of the era. Once again, where patterns confirmed that they had been used in real working conditions. They were found buried beneath collapsed sheds, inside abandoned workshops, and alongside rusted machinery. Their locations placed them firmly within industrial contexts, not ceremonial ones. Timber transport equipment provided even stronger evidence. Massive wooden sleds designed for hauling fresh logs were discovered in remote forest zones, often far from rivers or rail lines. These sleds were nearly double the size of typical logging sleds. Their frames were reinforced with thick beams. Their runners were unusually wide. The harness systems measured up to 7 feet from shoulder mount to load attachment. Engineering analysis suggested that moving such sleds at full capacity would require either large teams of animals or extremely powerful humans. However, many of these sleds were located in terrain where animal transport would have been impractical. Deep snow, dense forests, and uneven ground made horse teams inefficient. At the same time, there was little evidence of large-scale animal infrastructure such as stables, fodder storage, or veterinary facilities. This suggested that human labor had been the primary source of traction. If so, that labor would have needed exceptional strength and size. Architectural remains added another dimension to the pattern. Abandoned bunkhouses, storage huts, and communal facilities in former logging camps displayed consistent oversizing. Doorways frequently measured 10 to 12 feet in height. Ceilings rose far above what was necessary for heat conservation. Sleeping platforms were built 30 to 40 inches off the ground, making them uncomfortable for average workers. Tables and benches were positioned at heights that forced normal-sized men to sit awkwardly with dangling legs. These buildings were described in historical records as temporary structures, constructed quickly at the beginning of each logging season and dismantled or abandoned afterward. In such conditions, builders would have aimed for efficiency and economy. Extra timber meant extra labor. Extra height meant extra heating loss in winter. Oversized construction would have been a disadvantage unless it was required by the occupants. Despite this, most academic explanations dismissed these features as regional traditions or construction errors. Some suggested that decay had distorted measurements. Others argued that exaggerated dimensions improved ventilation. None of these theories explained the remarkable consistency across dozens of sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. Foreign industrial surveys provided indirect confirmation. German, French, and Scandinavian reports from the late 19th century occasionally mentioned specialized equipment designed for exceptional laborers. These remarks were brief and unexplored. After 1911, even these references disappeared. Surveys continued, but descriptions became standardized and generic. Photographs focused on machinery and infrastructure rather than workers. Human variation was no longer documented. Taken together, the tools, transport systems, and buildings formed a coherent pattern. They were not random anomalies. They were components of a system adapted to operators of unusual size and strength. Yet modern institutions categorize these objects as unclear, ceremonial, or anomalous rather than confront their practical implications. This second layer of evidence transformed the mystery. The photographs could be dismissed individually. The tools could be misclassified. The buildings could be reinterpreted. But together, they formed a material record that supported the same conclusion. The Siberian logging industry of the late 19th century had been structured, at least in part, around workers who no longer appear in official history. Their absence from modern narratives was not due to lack of evidence, but to a lack of willingness to interpret it. The most disturbing aspect of this investigation is not simply the possibility that unusually large individuals once worked in Siberian industry. It is the consistent refusal of modern institutions to examine this possibility seriously. When historians are presented with photographic evidence, most acknowledge that the images are authentic. The negatives, prints, and archival records are genuine. The dates are verified. The photographers are known. Yet despite this, the scale differences are almost always dismissed as camera distortion, perspective tricks, or visual illusion. Rarely is a detailed technical explanation offered. Few attempt to demonstrate how hundreds of images, taken by different photographers using different equipment across several decades, could all produce the same type of illusion in the same way. Museum curators respond in a similar manner when confronted with oversized tools and equipment. They often label such artifacts as unclear purpose, specialized, or possibly ceremonial. These categories effectively remove the objects from serious industrial analysis. Once an item is classified as symbolic or exceptional, it no longer needs to fit into practical history. This approach avoids uncomfortable questions about who used the tools and why they were necessary. Architectural historians likewise describe oversized worker housing as cultural tradition, stylistic preference, or regional variation, without addressing the economic inefficiency of such designs in extreme climates. This pattern does not represent deliberate falsification. There is little evidence of coordinated destruction or overt censorship. Instead, it reflects a quieter form of suppression, institutional indifference. Certain interpretations are simply never pursued. Research proposals that challenge established models are rarely funded. Articles that raise uncomfortable implications struggle to find publication. Over time, entire lines of inquiry disappear, not through force but through neglect. The timing of the disappearance of documentation deepens the mystery. The early 20th century marked a period of expanding bureaucracy, improved record-keeping, and increased standardization. Governments and corporations began tracking workers more closely than ever before. Personnel files, medical records, payroll systems, and identity documents became common. In theory, this period should have produced more detailed information about labor forces. Instead, evidence of unusually large workers vanished. The Russian Revolution is often cited as a convenient explanation. Archives were destroyed. Institutions collapsed. Records were lost. Yet this explanation fails to account for the parallel disappearance in foreign sources. French, Swedish, and German records changed in the same period, before the revolution fully unfolded. This suggests that political chaos alone cannot explain the shift. Something more systematic was occurring in how labor was documented and remembered. There is also no demographic evidence to support natural explanations. There are no records of widespread disease targeting unusually tall individuals. No migration patterns indicate that they relocated en masse to other regions. No medical literature describes a sudden disappearance of extreme height variation. If such individuals had continued to exist elsewhere, they would have appeared in military records, census data, hospitals, or industrial projects. They did not. One photograph from 1907 remains particularly revealing. It shows a small logging crew standing beside a stack of freshly cut timber near a temporary shelter. The image is simple and unposed. 9 men stand at roughly the same height. One stands far above them, holding a log with apparent ease. He is not placed in the center. He is not separated. He is not labeled. He is simply there. A colleague, a worker, a participant in daily labor. This image captures the core contradiction. In his own time, this man was not treated as extraordinary. In modern history, his existence has become almost impossible. This contradiction raises broader questions about how historical narratives are constructed. History is often presented as a complete and objective record. In reality, it is shaped by institutional priorities, cultural assumptions, and political convenience. Information that fits existing models is preserved and emphasized. Information that complicates those models is minimized, reinterpreted, or forgotten. By ignoring evidence of unusual workers, historians may have erased more than biological anomalies. They may have erased alternative labor systems, forgotten training methods, lost engineering practices, and misunderstood social hierarchies. Industrial achievements attributed solely to machinery and organization may have depended partly on human capacities that no longer exist or are no longer recognized. The remaining artifacts still exist. Massive saws rest in museum storage rooms. Oversized sleds rot in frozen clearings. Tall doorways stand in abandoned settlements. Glass plate negatives sit in archival drawers. These fragments form a scattered record of something that once played a functional role in economic life. The question is no longer whether evidence exists. It clearly does. The question is why it has been consistently ignored. What assumptions prevent scholars from interpreting it honestly? What pressures discourage investigation? And what other aspects of recent history have been quietly simplified to preserve comfortable narratives? Until these questions are addressed, an important chapter of human experience remains incomplete. The Siberian forests still contain traces of those who worked within them. The archives still hold images of forgotten laborers. They wait for researchers willing to look without predetermined conclusions and to accept that the past may be stranger, more complex, and more unsettling than official history allows.